The first instrument in the story of the Teatro Amazonas was not a violin. It was a knife. Before sunrise, somewhere beside one of the Amazon's countless tributaries, a worker drew a shallow diagonal cut across the bark of a rubber tree. A small cup waited below it. The tree released a narrow line of milk, white latex, slowly enough that gathering it demanded a path through the forest. Tree after tree, morning after morning, the worker would return after the latex had drained into the cup before rising heat and falling tree pressure slowed the flow, collect what the trees had given, and begin turning liquid into something the industrial world could buy. That latex would be smoked, hardened, carried by foot and canoe, passed to a trader, loaded onto a riverboat, and sent toward cities that many of the people who gathered it would never experience from a velvet seat. At the far end of the journey stood a chandelier. In Manaus, roughly 1,600 kilometers upriver from the Atlantic, an opera house rises above the rooftops beneath a dome of green, yellow, blue, and white. Its interior combines Carrara marble, with surfaces skillfully finished to imitate it. Murano glass hangs over a horseshoe-shaped auditorium. Iron crossed from Glasgow, decorative pieces came from France, artists arrived from Europe, and tens of thousands of colored tiles were carried across an ocean and then deep into a continent to crown the building like an enormous jeweled cap. Outside, the air is heavy enough to feel touched. Rain can erase the far side of a square in seconds. The Rio Negro passes the city like a dark inland sea, and beyond it begins a green immensity without any obligation to human scale. Yet on the last night of 1896, guests entered the new Teatro Amazonas dressed for a world of painted ceilings, gilded balconies, and opera. The contradiction was deliberate. Manaus was not presenting itself as a remote settlement that had somehow acquired a theater. It was announcing that remoteness no longer applied. The world's factories needed a substance found in the Amazon. Ships could climb the river to collect it, and the city intended to make distance kneel. Manaus was not alone. Far downstream, near the Atlantic gateway of the Amazon, Belfame had already built the Teatro de Paz. It opened in 1878 and later acquired the lavish interiors that made it the elder partner in an extraordinary cultural circuit. International companies could perform in Belfame, continue upriver to Manaus, and carry European music along the same waterway that carried Amazonian rubber in the opposite direction. On the 27th of July 2026, UNESCO joined these places on the World Heritage List under one name, the Amazonia Theaters. The listing includes not only the two buildings, but also the great public squares around them. Together, they preserve the remains of a moment when two river cities tried to compress the distance between the rainforest and Europe, and succeeded just long enough to build monuments that would outlive the fortune behind them. The beautiful version of this story fits easily beneath a painted dome. Rubber made two cities rich. Rich cities built opera houses, and music arrived in the Amazon. The marble grows heavier once the supply chain comes into view. The same river carried luxuries toward the cities, and debt toward the forest. Migrants entered rubber camps owing money before they had cut a single tree. Indigenous knowledge helped begin the trade. Many indigenous communities saw land, labor, and lives consumed by it. The buildings did not create those abuses, but they rose from an economy that kept them out of sight. And the celebration contained another secret. In 1876, 20 years before the Manaus Theater opened, a shipment of roughly 70,000 rubber tree seeds left the region around Santarfem for Britain. Most failed, only a few thousand germinated. The surviving seedlings and their descendants became the genetic foundation of plantation rubber across parts of Asia. While workers fitted the jeweled dome, the future rival that would bankrupt the boom was already taking root on the other side of the world. The lights are still on. The fortune is gone. To understand how a knife in the forest became a chandelier and how a handful of seeds nearly silenced an opera house, we have to follow the river from the trees to the stage. The blade entered this story long before the chandelier did. Across the Americas, indigenous communities had already spent centuries shaping natural latex into useful waterproof objects when European observers began treating it as a botanical trick, impressive, unpredictable, and not yet very useful. Raw rubber could soften and become sticky in heat, then harden or crack in cold. It was fascinating but unreliable. In the 19th century, experiments with heat and sulfur produced vulcanized rubber, a form that remained useful across a much wider range of conditions. Suddenly, the strange sap of a tropical tree could become belts for machinery, seals for engines, hoses, insulation for electrical wires, waterproof goods, medical equipment, and countless small components that allowed an industrial system to move without leaking, slipping, or shaking itself apart. Then came the bicycle. Pneumatic tires turned a hard, punishing ride into something faster and more comfortable. Automobiles followed, and every new wheel multiplied demand. The modern world was learning to roll on rubber at exactly the moment factories, steamships, telegraph lines, and electrical networks were expanding across continents. A material that had once seemed exotic became essential. The most valuable source was Hevea brasiliensis, the parfait rubber tree native to the Amazon basin. The species grew across the basin, but the forest did not arrange the trees for human convenience. Wild rubber trees stood scattered among countless other species. A tapper could not stand in one plantation row and move neatly to the next. He followed a long circuit through dense forest, often beginning before daylight, cutting and collecting from trees separated by distance, mud, insects, water, and thick vegetation. That geography shaped the economy. Rubber began as thousands of small movements through the forest. Latex traveled from cups to camps, from camps to canoes, from tributaries to larger rivers. It passed through warehouses and credit networks, onto steamships, and eventually toward factories in Europe and North America. The Amazon had few overland roads. Its rivers served as roads on a continental scale. In 1867, Brazil opened the Amazon and several tributaries to international merchant navigation. The decision made an existing river world more directly accessible to foreign shipping and global capital. Belfame stood near the ocean, facing entrance. Manaus stood far inland on the Rio Negro, close to its meeting with the Solimões, where two immense water systems joined to form the main course of the Amazon. One city watched the river open toward the Atlantic. The other gathered the wealth flowing out of the interior Every. Industrial revolution creates a center of gravity. Rubber created two along the same river system. Belfame was already old when rubber transformed it. Founded in the colonial era, it had long served as a military, administrative, and commercial gateway to northern Brazil. Its port connected the interior to the Atlantic, and its elite did not need rubber to invent the city. Rubber did something more dramatic. It enlarged the city's ambitions, accelerated its trade, reshaped its avenues and public spaces, and gave local society the money to perform modernity on an international scale. The cornerstone of the Teatro da Paz was laid in March 1869, before the years that UNESCO defines as the rubber cycle's economic peak. Its original name invoked hopes for peace as the Paraguayan War approached its end. Construction continued through disputes, delays, and rising costs. The building was substantially complete by 1874, but Belfame waited until the 15th of February 1878 for the doors to open. The delay gave the theater an unusual biography. It was conceived before rubber reached its peak, then repeatedly enlarged and embellished as the money intensified. Renovations from 1887 to 1890, and again in 1904 and 1905, created much of the splendor visitors recognize today. The Teatro da Paz did not simply rise from the boom, it grew richer with it. Its design drew inspiration from Milan's La Scala, but it was never a simple copy. A Brazilian military engineer, José Tib Faercio de Magal Faias, produced the original project. Another engineer, Antonio Augusto Calandrini de Chermont, altered it during construction. Later renovations changed the facade, corrected structural problems, and wrapped the interior in the artistic language of the Amazonian Belle Époque. On opening night, Belfame's upper class entered beneath the new facade while ordinary residents gathered outside to watch officials and prominent families arrive. The first presentation was not an opera but a French melodrama, The Two Orphans. The first opera followed on the 7th of August 1880 with Verdi's Ernani from the beginning. The building offered two performances at once, one on the stage and another in the audience. The auditorium followed the horseshoe form associated with European opera houses, an architecture designed as much for seeing across the room as for seeing the stage. Boxes placed rank on display. Jewelry, fabric, posture, and proximity to power became part of the evening. The theater was a machine for turning wealth into visibility. Artists Crispim do Amaral and Domenico de Angelis helped create the sumptuous interior during the later 19th century renovations. Classical figures appeared among Amazonian plants, animals, and stylized indigenous imagery. Crystal chandeliers glittered inside. Carrara marble statues and imported busts honored Brazilian writers and composers. Local woods and Amazonian motifs appeared beneath decorative traditions brought from abroad. The result was not Europe repeated perfectly in Brazil. It was Europe translated, edited, and made to speak with an Amazonian accent. The square around the theater mattered almost as much as the building. It organized the center of Belfame, linked performance to public life, and turned arrival into spectacle. The elite passed inside, but the city occupied the space around them. Over time, that outside audience would become central to the theater's transformation from a symbol of exclusivity into a civic institution. Belfame had built the Amazon's first great palace of performance. Manaus, newly enriched at the boom's height, more isolated from the Atlantic, and increasingly impatient with the word peripheral, intended to answer with something the world could not ignore. To understand the confidence of Manaus, it helps to forget the modern instinct to measure distance by highways. The city had no need to pretend the river was an obstacle. Ocean-going vessels could navigate the Amazon system to reach its port. Rubber descended from the forest. Imported goods, machinery, performers, fashions, and news climbed upstream. A city 1,600 kilometers from the ocean could still face the world through water. Manaus had begun as a small colonial outpost. By the end of the 19th century, it was becoming an international trading center of roughly 50,000 people, swollen by merchants, officials, foreign technicians, laborers, and migrants from Brazil's drought-stricken northeast. Rubber revenue financed avenues, squares, port works, water infrastructure, electric services, and tramways. The transformation happened so quickly that the city seemed to acquire a new identity between one ship and the next. At the waterfront, the boom had a physical rhythm. Riverboats arrived with dark masses of cured rubber and passengers carrying everything they owned. Warehouses weighed, graded, and recorded the commodity before larger vessels took it toward the Atlantic. In the opposite direction came crates of wine, pianos, machinery, clothing, decorative metal, theater scenery, and the private desires of a city learning how much the world was willing to sell it. The river did not merely connect Manaus to modernity. During the boom, the river made Manaus one of modernity's suppliers. Later stories claim that rubber barons lit cigars with banknotes, gave French champagne to horses, and sent laundry across the Atlantic to be washed. The evidence behind each legend is uneven. Their persistence is more revealing than their accuracy. They show how Manaus came to be imagined, a place where money had lost its sense of gravity, where distance made luxury more desirable, because every imported object proved that distance had been conquered, and Opera House was the largest proof of all. A serious proposal appeared in 1881. A competition followed, and the selected design came from a Portuguese engineering office in Lisbon. The cornerstone was laid in 1884, but construction stalled amid cancelled contracts, political changes, technical difficulties, and cost. For years, the unfinished project stood as an ambition without a roof. Governor Eduardo Gonçalves Ribeiro revived the work in the early 1890s, when rubber money was remaking Manaus at full speed. A mixed workforce of Brazilian and foreign workers and technicians took part in the renewed effort. The Italian architect Celestial Sicardum coordinated important phases. Crispim do Amaral contributed paintings, ornament, furniture, and the visual imagination that would connect the interior to the rivers outside. The theater was neither a private toy nor the gift of a single rubber baron. It was a civic project backed by a government whose accounts were swollen by rubber, and a commercial elite whose power depended on it. State and merchant shared the same desire to make the Amazon look like the center of the modern world, not its distant supplier. They were not building an opera house because the city lacked somewhere to hear music. They were building proof that geography no longer had the authority to decide where grandeur was allowed to exist. The Teatro Amazonas was inaugurated on the 31st of December 1896, with some decorative work still unfinished. A week later, on the 7th of January 1897, audiences heard the first opera performance there, Ponchielli's La Gioconda. It is tempting to compress those dates into one perfect opening night, but the truth is more appropriate to the building. The spectacle arrived in stages, assembled across years by politics, money, craft, delay, and determination. From the square, the dome dominates first. An iron structure supports roughly 36,000 glazed pieces imported from Alsace, arranged in the colors of the Brazilian flag. Under tropical light, it does not retreat into the architecture. It flashes above the city, patriotic, theatrical, and almost defiantly visible. Inside, the inventory reads like the cargo list of an age convinced that anything could be moved for the right price. Iron and steel came from Glasgow. Carrara marble crossed from Italy. Murano glass became chandeliers. French fittings, roofing materials, furniture, and decorative pieces moved through the Atlantic and up the Amazon. European architects and artists joined Brazilian craftsmen, painters, and laborers. Yet the popular image of a European theater shipped intact into the jungle is wrong. Amazonian woods appear in the floors and fittings. Brazilian artists shaped its most memorable images. Some surfaces that appear to be marble are skillful imitations. The building borrows the Italian form of the opera house, mixes neoclassical and eclectic influences, and fills them with rivers, vegetation, animals, and local symbols. It is less a piece of Europe transplanted than a Brazilian argument with Europe, conducted in marble, paint, wood, iron, and light. The stage curtain makes the argument unmistakable. Crispim do Amaral painted the meeting of the waters, where the dark Rio Negro runs beside the pale sediment, heavy Solim phase before the two gradually mingle. The curtain rises vertically, so the painted rivers do not fold into themselves. Before an imported opera could begin, the audience faced one of the Amazon's greatest natural spectacles. Above the auditorium, painted panels create the illusion of looking upward beneath a monumental iron structure, often compared to a view from under the Eiffel Tower. In the noble hall, Domenico De Angelis joined allegories of the fine arts with Amazonian plants and animals. Classical Europe supplied a vocabulary, but the Amazon kept entering the sentence. The result was a building designed to erase provincial shame and yet unable to hide where it stood. Forest timber supported the feet of audiences admiring European music. The two rivers waited on the curtain. Tropical life climbed the walls. Even at its most imitative, the theater could not become European without first becoming Amazonian. International companies traveled between Belfast and Manaus, creating an Amazonian lyrical circuit tied to the river and the Atlantic. Performers who had crossed an ocean could appear in both houses. Scores, scenery, instruments, costumes, and reputations moved along the same commercial artery as the commodity paying for their journey. At one end of the chain stood a knife and a metal cup. At the other stood a chandelier read in one direction. That chain sounds like triumph, read in reverse, and it becomes a map of dependency. The rubber tree did not surrender its latex at a city warehouse. The work began far from paved avenues. In coercive camps, isolation weakened outside oversight and made escape harder. A tapper, known in Portuguese as a sarangueiro, followed a forest trail connecting widely scattered trees. He cut carefully enough to keep each tree productive, fixed cups beneath the incisions, gathered the latex, and processed it before humidity and time spoiled the day's work. The trail had to be learned almost as a piece of music is learned, through repetition until every turn lived in the body. A wrong cut could injure a tree, a missed collection cost part of the day. Rain altered paths and rivers, insects and fever did not respect a production schedule. When the latex was smoked and coagulated, it became heavier, darker, and ready to move, but the worker remained at the weakest end of a chain whose prices were set far away. The forest supplied the material and concealed the conditions under which it was taken. Many tappers came from northeastern Brazil, especially after devastating droughts in the late 1870s drove families from Sierra and neighboring regions. Recruiters and patrons offered passage, tools, food, and the prospect of earnings in a booming frontier. The offer often arrived in the form of credit. That credit system, known as aviamento, connected the forest to global trade. A merchant house advanced goods to a regional supplier. The supplier advanced transport, equipment, clothing, food, medicine, and other necessities to an estate owner or tapper. Rubber moved back up the chain in payment. On paper, it could look like an ordinary arrangement between people who lacked cash and people willing to finance a season. In practice, the person keeping the account also controlled the prices. Supplies could be marked far above their value, rubber could be purchased below its value, interest, transport, and new necessities accumulated. A worker might finish months of exhausting labor and be told that he owed more than when he entered the forest. Leaving while in debt could be forbidden by the patron, enforced by isolation, threat, or the simple fact that no independent transport was available. Conditions varied across an enormous region, and not every tapper lived under the same degree of coercion. Some earned money, built communities, and negotiated within the system. Others experienced a form of debt bondage that narrowed freedom to a line in somebody else's ledger. Disease, injury, hunger, loneliness, and river distances strengthened the power of whoever controlled supplies and boats. The arithmetic of the theater depended on this geography. Rubber was expensive because it was useful, but also because wild extraction required long routes and layers of credit. Wealth accumulated as the commodity moved toward the city. Debt accumulated as supplies moved toward the forest. The same river carried value in opposite forms. Indigenous communities stood even closer to the origin of the trade. Their knowledge of plants, forest paths, latex, and local environments had made rubber possible long before foreign factories demanded it. The boom brought invasion of territory, disease, raids, forced labor, and violence to many communities across the basin. In some places, especially the Putumayo region on the Peruvian and Colombian frontier, the search for rubber descended into systematic atrocity. Those crimes should not be rearranged for dramatic convenience. Putumayo was not Manaus, and no honest account can trace a particular block of marble or a particular chandelier directly to a particular victim. The theaters were public buildings in Brazilian cities, financed through governments and a broad commercial economy, not receipts attached to one notorious company. The connection is larger and more unsettling. The opera houses rose from an economic system that produced extraordinary urban wealth while trapping many workers in debt, coercion, disease, and isolation. The same boom that decorated Amazonian landscapes inside elite halls destabilized the lives of people who inhabited those landscapes outside them. Stylized indigenous figures could appear on a ceiling, while living indigenous communities had almost no power over the wealth extracted from their land. The audience saw the chandeliers. It did not see the miles walked beneath the canopy. Distance allowed the final buyer to see only the finished miracle. A motorist in Paris felt a smoother road. An audience in Manaus saw light scatter through Murano glass. Neither had to picture the worker opening a tree before dawn, although both experiences began with his knife. The theater did not merely entertain the rubber economy. It translated extraction into beauty. Harsh labor became soft velvet. Forest paths became polished corridors. A pale liquid collected in a tin cup became light scattering through Murano glass. There was one final irony. The elites of Belfim and Manaus believed imported culture proved their access to the world. That access also allowed the world to learn how to replace them. In 1876, a British planter and explorer named Henry Wickham collected roughly 70,000 seeds from Hevea brasiliensis near Santar-Feidham. He arranged for them to leave Brazil aboard a British vessel and reach the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. The episode would later be celebrated in Britain as imperial enterprise and remembered in Brazil as botanical theft. Wickham later embroidered the voyage into a smuggling adventure, while Brazil remembered it as botanical theft. No law clearly banned the export of rubber seeds in 1876. What made the episode consequential was not a customs violation, but an imperial network removing genetic wealth from one region and rebuilding an industry elsewhere without asking who would pay for the transfer. Most of the seeds failed. Fewer than 3,000 germinated. In another story, that survival rate would look like disaster. Here it was enough to redirect a global industry. Seedlings traveled from Kew to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and to other colonial botanical stations. Over time, their descendants spread through British Malaya and other parts of Southeast Asia. Success did not come immediately. Trees needed years to mature. Botanists and planters had to learn how to propagate them, tap them without damage organized labor, and turn experimental plantings into vast commercial estates. The Asian rubber industry was built over decades, not produced overnight by one ship and one man. But plantations held an advantage the Amazon forest could not easily copy. In South America, wild rubber trees were dispersed among many species, while attempts to concentrate them in plantations proved highly vulnerable to South American leaf blight. In Asia, far from that native pathogen, planters could arrange trees in regular rows. A worker could tap hundreds without walking a long forest circuit. Roads, railways, ports, standardized processing, colonial finance, and low-cost labor tightened the chain from tree to market. The contrast was almost cruelly neat. Amazonian rubber came from a living forest whose diversity kept the trees apart. Asian rubber came from plantations that turned biological uniformity into industrial efficiency. The forest had created the species. Empire reorganized it as a machine. The timing gives the Teatro Amazonas its deepest irony. Wickham's seeds left in 1876. The cornerstone of the Opera House was laid 8 years later. The building opened 20 years after the seeds crossed the Atlantic. While Manaus was importing iron, marble, glass, and artistic prestige, the biological foundation of its market dominance was traveling outward. The city celebrated global connection without realizing that connection had already carried away its advantage. For a time, demand grew fast enough to shelter everyone. Bicycles multiplied. Automobile production accelerated. Prices remained attractive, and the Amazon's wild rubber economy seemed secure. Then Asian plantations reached scale. Their output became more consistent, their costs lower, and their connection to imperial ports more efficient. By the early 1910s, plantation rubber was overtaking Brazilian production. The market did not stop needing rubber. it stopped needing the Amazon to supply most of it. This was globalization in one of its clearest early forms. A tree from South America was studied in Europe, multiplied in Asia, financed through empire, and sold back into a world market that compared every pound by price. The Amazon had believed possession of the species guaranteed possession of the industry. The plantations proved that biology could be detached from place, reorganized, and made to compete against its own homeland. That difference is essential. The boom did not collapse because rubber became obsolete. It collapsed because the world found a cheaper Amazon somewhere else. Own Bag of Seeds did not destroy Manaus. Botanical gardens, colonial governments, investors, transport networks, and decades of Asian labor turned Wickham's shipment into an industry. But the image remains irresistible. Seeds traveling east, colored tiles traveling west, and two ships passing through the same global system while carrying opposite futures. Then the current reversed, the river still ran toward the Atlantic, but the money no longer ran back. Asian production expanded, rubber prices fell, and the Amazon's share of the world market collapsed. Commercial houses lost power, public revenue shrank. Imported seasons became harder to sustain. The men who had treated isolation as a minor inconvenience discovered that, without boom, era profits, distance regained its price. The bus did not erase the cities. Belfame remained a major port and state capital. Manaus endured a long decline, then found a new industrial future after the Manaus Free Trade Zone was created in 1957 and expanded into a tax-incentivized industrial model in 1967. It eventually grew into a metropolis of more than 2 million. What died was the fantasy of effortless wealth. The theaters absorbed the shock more slowly. International seasons thinned, maintenance suffered, and tropical humidity worked on the interiors. Teatro Amazonas passed through music, silence, alteration, neglect, and repair. Not a 90-year abandonment, but an uneven struggle to keep the boom's most visible survivor alive. That survival reveals something the original builders may not have intended. A monument can outlive the social class that used it to display power. Once the money disappears, the meaning becomes available for negotiation. Brazil granted federal heritage protection to the Teatro da Paz in 1963 and to the Teatro Amazonas in 1966. Restoration work continued across the following decades. In Manaus, a major campaign from 1987 to 1990 recovered decorative elements and returned the building closer to its original design. In Belfame, repeated interventions repaired a theater whose present beauty is itself a record of change, not a frozen 19th century moment. The more important restoration took place on stage. The Orquestra Sinfônica do Teatro da Paz was created in 1996. The Modern Amazonas Opera Festival began in 1997 and helped support orchestras, choirs, dancers, technicians, craftspeople, and performers in Manaus. Opera returned, but it no longer arrived only as a luxury imported for rubber elites. The buildings gradually became more Amazonian because the public around them changed who they served. Their programs expanded beyond the European canon. Boi Bum Fé, Caram Fé, brega, popular music, theater, dance, film, and contemporary regional work entered spaces once designed to prove that local elites could imitate the cultural life of Europe. The old architecture remained, but ownership of its meaning shifted. That shift altered the sound of the rooms. An aria could still rise beneath the painted ceilings, but it could now share a season with rhythms, stories, accents, and performers rooted in northern Brazil. Students learned backstage trades that the original elite had imported. Local orchestras no longer had to exist only as temporary companions to visiting companies. A building conceived as evidence that Manaus and Belfame could belong to somebody else's cultural world became infrastructure for producing a cultural world of their own. That change is visible outside as well. The Largo de Esfeo Sebastifeo in Manaus and Praia da República in Belfame are not empty frames around protected monuments. They are active pieces of urban life. People cross them without attending an opera. Vendors, worshippers, families, tourists, demonstrators, musicians, and workers use the spaces that 19th century planners shaped around elite arrival. The audience that once watched from outside has moved closer to the center of the story. This is also why UNESCO recognized two ensembles rather than two isolated facades. The new World Heritage Property includes the theaters and their surrounding squares, the architectural objects, and the civic stages around them. It follows a river relationship, Belfame at the Atlantic Gateway, Manaus deep in the interior, both connected by trade, performers, artists, materials, and ambition. The final UNESCO process briefly threatened to separate the two-city nomination. An ICOMOS backed draft decision proposed inscribing only the Manaus component and excluding the Teatro da Paz in Belfamem. During the committee process, a formal amendment proposed by Lebanon and co-sponsored by Peru restored the Belfamem component and criteria 2 and 4. Keeping the pair together, that choice makes the story more truthful. Belfay and Manaus were not identical twins. One was an established port enriched and remodeled by export wealth. The other became the spectacular inland capital of the boom. One theater opened before the peak and accumulated its lavish appearance through later renovations. The other rose as the peak approached its most confident moment. Together they show how a commodity reshaped different cities along the same artery. UNESCO's decision did more than praise the architecture. It also called for deeper research into what rubber extraction did to indigenous peoples, northeastern migrants, and the environment. The chandeliers would be preserved, but the miles beneath the canopy could no longer be edited out. That is the right way to look at these buildings. Their beauty is real, so is the ambition that carried stone, iron, glass, paint, music, and people along one of the greatest river systems on Earth. So is the ingenuity of artists who combined European theatrical form with Amazonian wood, rivers, vegetation, animals, and color. And so is the inequality that made magnificence visible in the city, while keeping much of its cost out of sight. The rubber barons are gone. So are the monopoly and the commercial empire that connected scattered trees to factories across the Atlantic. What survived was not the elite's ownership of these buildings, but the city's ability to change what the buildings mean. At night, the dome of the Teatro Amazonas still catches the light above Manaus. Far downstream, the Teatro da Paz opens onto a square that has watched fortunes, fashions, governments, and audiences change. The theaters no longer need to prove that the Amazon can imitate Europe. They now hold an Amazonian memory that Europe helped shape but could never own. The first instrument was a knife. It released the latex paid for the chandelier. The seeds carried the fortune away, yet the theaters remained, and the audience that once watched from the square now helps decide what happens inside. Now an orchestra plays beneath a ceiling filled with the forest. Behind the performers, the painted rivers wait beyond the doors. The real river continues past the city, carrying no applause and needing none. The music came last. The first performance had already begun among the trees.